Close your eyes. I want you to think about Egypt. I want you to picture the Great Pyramid of Giza rising from the desert floor, that enormous golden triangle of limestone blocks shimmering in the heat, 2,300,000 stones stacked with a precision that modern engineers still cannot fully explain, built around 2560 BC for the pharaoh Khufu, a monument so massive that it was the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. You know this image. Everyone knows this image. It is one of the most recognizable structures ever built by human hands, and it represents, in the popular imagination, the dawn of civilization itself, the moment when human beings stopped being primitive and started being something else, something organized and ambitious and capable of reshaping the physical world on a monumental scale. Now I want you to hold that image in your mind, the Great Pyramid rising from the Egyptian desert, and I want you to do something that almost nobody ever does. I want you to look west. I want you to cross the Atlantic Ocean, the same ocean that will not be crossed by anyone for another 4,000 years, and I want you to look at North America. Because here is the thing that nobody tells you, the thing that is missing from almost every history class and every documentary and every timeline of human civilization that you have ever seen. While Egypt was building the pyramids, North America was not empty. North America was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. North America was full of people, and those people were building things too. They were building enormous earthen mounds that rival the pyramids in ambition, if not in height. They were constructing planned communities with precise geometric layouts that align with astronomical events. They were developing sophisticated trade networks that moved goods thousands of miles across the continent. They were creating technologies and knowledge systems and ways of living that were every bit as complex and every bit as impressive as anything happening on the banks of the Nile, and yet almost nobody knows about any of it. That is what tonight's story is about. Tonight we are going to do something that I have never seen any documentary or any history book do properly. We are going to run two timelines side by side. We are going to start in Egypt around 3500 BC, when the first stirrings of what will become pharaonic civilization are beginning to emerge in the Nile Valley. And we are going to look at what is happening in North America at exactly the same time. And then we are going to walk forward through the centuries, millennium by millennium, watching both continents develop in parallel, watching both hemispheres of the planet produce civilizations that are extraordinary and complex and deeply human, and we're going to ask why you know everything about one of them and almost nothing about the other. This is not a story about one civilization being better than another. This is a story about parallel genius. This is a story about two branches of the human family, separated by an ocean that neither of them knew how to cross, independently inventing agriculture, architecture, astronomy, engineering, trade, art, religion, and governance, at roughly the same time on opposite sides of the planet without any contact with each other whatsoever. And when you see the two timelines running side by side, when you see what was happening in North America while Egypt was building the pyramids, you will never look at either continent the same way again. Let us start at the beginning. Let us start around 3500 BC, 5,500 years ago, in a world that looks very different from the one you know. The Sahara Desert does not exist yet. Or rather, it exists, but it is not a desert. In 3500 BC, the Sahara is green. It is covered with grassland and scattered trees and lakes and rivers, and it is home to cattle herders and fishermen and farmers who have been living there for thousands of years. The climate is shifting slowly, the rains are failing, the lakes are shrinking, and the people of the Sahara are beginning to move, drifting toward the one reliable source of water in the region, the Nile River, which cuts through the landscape like a green ribbon through brown cloth. The lakes of the Sahara are home to hippopotamuses and crocodiles. The grasslands support herds of cattle tended by people who paint images of their animals on rock shelter walls, images so vivid and so full of life that when European explorers found them thousands of years later they could not believe they were looking at the Sahara, the driest desert on Earth. But the green Sahara is dying. The orbital cycles that brought the monsoon rains northward are shifting, the rains are retreating south, and the lakes are shrinking and the grasslands are turning to sand, slowly over centuries pushing the people who live there toward the only reliable water source in the region. This migration, this slow compression of people into the Nile Valley as the Sahara dries, is one of the forces that will drive the creation of Egyptian civilization. More people in a smaller space means more competition for resources, which means more need for organization, which means more need for leaders and laws and systems of distribution and record keeping, which means eventually pharaohs and pyramids and hieroglyphics and everything else that we associate with ancient Egypt. In 3500 BC, Egypt is not yet Egypt. There is no unified kingdom. There are no pharaohs. The Nile Valley is home to a collection of small agricultural communities, some of them quite sophisticated, growing wheat and barley and flax, raising cattle and sheep and goats, making pottery and weaving linen and trading with each other up and down the river. They are building villages of mud brick. They are burying their dead with grave goods that suggest belief in an afterlife. They are developing the technologies and the social structures that will eventually coalesce into one of the most powerful civilizations the ancient world has ever seen. But in 3500 BC, they are not there yet. They are at the beginning. Now look west, cross the Atlantic, look at North America in 3500 BC. What do you see? If you were taught the standard version of history, you see nothing. You see a vast empty wilderness inhabited by scattered bands of primitive hunter-gatherers living in a state of nature, unchanged and unchanging, waiting for civilization to arrive from somewhere else. This is wrong. This is spectacularly, breathtakingly wrong. And the proof is sitting in the mud of northeastern Louisiana, in a bend of a small bayou called Watson Break, where in 3500 BC, roughly 1,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, the people of North America built something extraordinary. Watson Break is the oldest known mound complex in North America, and when I say oldest, I mean it is old enough to make your head spin. The site consists of 11 earthen mounds connected by ridges, forming an oval enclosure roughly 900 feet across. The tallest mound is 25 feet high. That may not sound like much compared to the Great Pyramid, but consider what it represents. In 3500 BC, the people who built Watson Break were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, living on fish from the bayous and deer from the forests and nuts from the hickory and oak trees that grew in abundance in the river bottoms of what is now Louisiana. They had no agriculture. They had no pottery, or at least very little. They had no metal tools. They had no domesticated animals except dogs, and yet they organized themselves somehow to build 11 mounds connected by earthen ridges in a precise geometric pattern that required the coordinated labor of hundreds of people over a period of decades or possibly centuries. Think about the implications. In 3500 BC, when the most sophisticated structures in the Nile Valley were mud brick villages, and the most advanced architecture in Mesopotamia was the ziggurat at Eridu, still a relatively modest structure, the people of Louisiana were building a complex of connected earthen mounds that enclosed a space the size of several football fields. They were not just piling dirt, they were engineering the landscape. The mounds are connected by ridges that are remarkably uniform in height, suggesting careful planning and controlled construction. The oval shape of the enclosure is regular enough to imply that the builders had a plan, a mental image of the finished product that they executed over a period of years or decades, adjusting and refining as they went. This is architecture. This is community planning. This is the physical manifestation of a shared vision that transcended any single individual's lifetime. How do you build something like Watson Break without a pharaoh? How do you organize the labor of hundreds of people to haul millions of baskets of earth to precise locations over a period of decades without a centralized authority telling them what to do? The honest answer is that we do not know. The people of Watson Break left no written records. They left no artwork that we can interpret with confidence. They left almost nothing except the mounds themselves and the artifacts scattered in and around them, stone tools and bone tools and the remains of the food they ate, which tells us what they ate but not what they believed or how they governed themselves or why they decided to reshape the landscape on such an enormous scale. But the mounds are there. They are real. They have been dated and measured and excavated, and they are incontrovertibly 5,500 years old, 1,000 years older than the Great Pyramid, built by people who were supposed to be too primitive to build anything at all, and they were not building blindly. The layout of Watson Break is deliberate and planned. The 11 mounds are not scattered randomly. They are positioned in an oval pattern that encloses a central plaza, and the ridges connecting them create a continuous walkway around the perimeter, a design that suggests the entire complex was conceived as a unified whole before construction began. Someone, or some group of people, looked at this bend in the bayou, and imagined a shape that did not exist, a geometric form imposed on the natural landscape, and then they made it real. They made it real without surveyor's tools, without blueprints, without any of the technologies that we associate with planned construction. They did it with stakes and chords and line of sight, and an understanding of geometry that was carried in the mind, not written on paper. The tallest mound at Watson Brake, Mound A, is positioned at the southwestern end of the oval, and it commands a view of the entire complex and the surrounding floodplain. Standing on top of it, you would have been able to see for miles across the bayou and the cypress swamps and the river bottom forest, and you would have been able to see anyone approaching from any direction. Whether this mound served a defensive purpose, or a ceremonial purpose, or a practical purpose as a lookout, we do not know, but its placement is intentional. Everything about Watson Brake is intentional. The people who built it knew exactly what they were doing. They just did not tell us why. The daily life at Watson Brake, as reconstructed from the archaeological evidence, was rich and varied. The people ate fish, lots of fish, including catfish and gar and drum and bowfin, all of which are abundant in the slow-moving bayous and oxbow lakes of the region. They ate deer and rabbit and turkey and squirrel. They ate enormous quantities of hickory nuts and acorns, which they processed by cracking the shells, boiling the nut meat in water to extract the oil and remove the tannins, and then using the resulting nut paste as a staple food that could be stored and eaten throughout the year. This is not foraging in the casual sense that the word implies. This is food processing on an industrial scale, organized and systematic, producing enough calories to support a population large enough to build 11 mounds over a period of decades. These were not people who spent every waking moment searching for their next meal. They had surplus, they had time, they had enough security and enough food to invest their labor in something that had no immediate practical benefit, something that existed purely because they wanted it to exist. Watson Brake is not alone. It is the oldest, but it's not the only ancient mound site in the lower Mississippi Valley. There are dozens of them, scattered across Louisiana and Mississippi and Arkansas, dating from roughly 3,500 BC to 2,800 BC, a 700-year tradition of mound building that predates Egyptian civilization, and that was carried out entirely by hunter-gatherer peoples who had no agriculture and no centralized government and no writing and none of the other things that historians have traditionally considered prerequisites for monumental construction. The existence of these sites forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. The standard narrative says that civilization begins with agriculture. You plant crops, you settle down, you produce surplus food, and that surplus allows some people to stop farming and start doing other things: building, governing, inventing, writing. This is how it happened in Mesopotamia and Egypt and China and the Indus Valley, and for a long time historians assumed it was how it had to happen everywhere. Watson Brake says otherwise. Watson Brake says that you do not need agriculture to build monuments, you do not need a pharaoh, you do not need a centralized state. You need a community with a shared purpose, a shared vision of what the landscape should look like, and enough social organization to carry that vision out over decades or centuries. The people of Watson Brake had all of these things. They just did it differently than the Egyptians. Let us move forward in time. Let us jump to 3100 BC, 400 years after Watson Brake was built. In Egypt, something momentous is happening. The small agricultural communities of the Nile Valley are being unified, by force and by negotiation, into a single kingdom. A man named Nama, or possibly Menes, the sources are confused, is credited with unifying Upper and Lower Egypt into one state, creating the first dynasty of pharaohs and establishing the political structure that will endure for 3,000 years. This is the birth of Pharaonic Egypt, one of the great turning points in human history, the moment when the Nile Valley goes from being a collection of farming villages to being a unified state with a god-king at its head, a professional bureaucracy, a system of writing, and the resources to build on a scale that the world has never seen before. What is happening in North America in 3100 BC? The mound-building tradition of the lower Mississippi Valley is continuing. New sites are being built, old sites are being expanded, and the technology of mound construction is becoming more sophisticated. The people of this region are developing a way of life that is uniquely American, based not on agriculture, but on the extraordinary abundance of the Mississippi River system, which provides fish and shellfish and waterfowl and turtles and freshwater mussels in quantities that can support large, settled communities without any need to plant crops. They are building their mounds in shapes and patterns that suggest astronomical alignment, that suggest a sophisticated understanding of the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars, the same kind of knowledge that the Egyptians are encoding in the orientation of their temples and tombs. Both civilizations are watching the sky. Both are reading the movements of the heavens and building structures that reflect what they see. They are doing it independently, on opposite sides of the world with no contact between them, and the parallels are striking. Now let us jump forward again, to a date that everyone knows, 2560 BC. This is the approximate date of the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest and most famous of the three pyramids on the Giza Plateau, built for the pharaoh Khufu over a period of roughly 20 years by a workforce of tens of thousands of labourers. The Great Pyramid is 481 feet tall. It covers 13 acres at its base. Its sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 1/12 of a degree. It contains roughly 2,300,000 blocks of limestone, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, with some of the internal granite blocks weighing as much as 80 tons. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary construction projects in the history of the world, and in 2560 BC it is brand new, gleaming white with its outer casing of polished Tura limestone, topped with a capstone that may have been covered in gold, visible for miles across the desert, a monument to the power of the pharaoh and the organizational genius of the Egyptian state. Imagine standing at the base of it. You tilt your head back and the pyramid fills the sky above you, its white casing stones catching the desert sun and throwing it back with a brightness that hurts your eyes. The scale is inhuman. The blocks above you are each as large as a refrigerator, some as large as a car, stacked with a precision that leaves gaps so narrow you cannot slide a playing card between them. The air is hot and dry and smells of limestone dust and the faint sulphur smell of the desert. Workers are still finishing the upper courses, tiny figures moving on scaffolding hundreds of feet above you, and the sound of copper chisels on stone carries down through the still air, a rhythmic tapping that has been the soundtrack of this place for 20 years, and that will fall silent soon, when the last casing stone is placed and the capstone is set, and the pyramid is complete, and the pharaoh Khufu will stand before his eternal house and know that he has built something that will outlast his name, his dynasty, his language, his civilization, and the desert itself. Now hold that image and cross the ocean. What is happening in North America in 2560 BC? Here is where the story gets interesting, because in 2560 BC, in the lower Mississippi Valley, another construction project is either underway or about to begin, and it is almost as astonishing as the Great Pyramid, though you have probably never heard of it. It is called Poverty Point, and it is one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the Americas. Poverty Point is located in northeastern Louisiana, near the present-day town of Epes, on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River floodplain. The site consists of a series of 6 concentric semicircular ridges, each one made of earth, arranged in a pattern that looks from the air like a giant half circle, or a letter C, with the open end facing the river. The outermost ridge is about 3/4 of a mile across. Inside the ridges, people lived in houses built on the raised earthen platforms, and the ridges themselves are thought to have been residential, with the spaces between them serving as walkways and drainage channels. To the west of the concentric ridges stands a massive earthen mound called Mound A, or the Bird Mound, because from the air it looks like a bird in flight. Mound A is 72 feet tall and roughly 700 feet long, making it one of the largest earthen structures in North America. It contains roughly 238,000 cubic meters of earth, all of it carried to the site in woven baskets on the backs of human beings, basket load by basket load, over a period of months or possibly years. Recent research suggests that Mound A may have been constructed in a single massive building campaign, possibly as quickly as 90 days, which would imply an organizational effort of staggering scale, hundreds or possibly thousands of people working together in a coordinated frenzy of construction. How many baskets of earth does it take to build a 72-foot mound 700 feet long? Millions, and every single one was carried on someone's back. That is not primitive. That is extraordinary. The people of Poverty Point were, like the people of Watson Brake before them, primarily hunter-gatherers. They fished the rivers and bayous. They hunted deer and waterfowl. They gathered nuts and seeds and roots and fruits from the forests and wetlands. But they were also traders on a continental scale. Artifacts found at Poverty Point include materials that came from hundreds and even thousands of miles away. Copper from the Great Lakes region, 1,000 miles to the north. Soapstone from the Appalachian Mountains, 1,000 miles to the east. Galena from Missouri. Magnetite from Arkansas. Hematite from distant sources. Flint and chert from a dozen different quarry sites across the eastern United States. The people of Poverty Point were at the center of a trade network that stretched across most of eastern North America, a network that moved raw materials and finished goods over distances that are almost incomprehensible for a society that had no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, and no navigable roads. They moved everything by canoe and on foot, paddling up rivers and walking through forests, carrying copper and soapstone and flint in bundles on their backs or in dugout canoes hollowed from single logs, and they made things. One of the most distinctive artifacts at Poverty Point is the Poverty Point object, or PPO, a small ball of fired clay about the size of a plum, shaped into distinctive forms, cylinders, spheres, biconical shapes, cross-grooved patterns that were used as cooking stones. The people of Poverty Point did not have pottery, or at least not much of it, so they cooked their food by heating these clay balls in a fire and then dropping them into pits lined with animal hide or woven baskets filled with water and food. The hot clay balls transferred their heat to the water, bringing it to a boil and cooking whatever was in the pit: fish, meat, roots, nuts. Millions of these clay cooking balls have been found at Poverty Point, literally millions, which gives you a sense of the scale and the duration of the occupation. This was not a temporary camp. This was a place where thousands of people lived and worked and cooked and traded for hundreds of years. And the cooking itself was an art. Each PPO was shaped by hand, and the shapes are not random. Different communities or different families seem to have preferred different shapes. An archaeologist can track the movement of people and ideas by following the distribution of PPO styles across the site and across the region. Some are grooved like tiny melons. Some are cylindrical like fingers. Some are biconical like two cones pressed base to base. Some are cross-hatched with geometric patterns pressed into the wet clay before firing. The variety suggests not just individual preference but cultural identity, a way of saying this is who I am, this is where I come from, this is how my people cook. The trade network centered on Poverty Point is one of the most impressive achievements of the ancient Americas, and it deserves to be understood in its full scope. Imagine a map of eastern North America. Now draw lines from Poverty Point in Louisiana to the copper sources on the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, where native copper, pure metallic copper, that occurs naturally in the rock, can be picked up from the ground or chipped from outcrops. That is a distance of over 1,000 miles, through dense forest and across dozens of rivers, and through the territories of countless other communities, each with their own languages and their own customs, and their own reasons to be suspicious of strangers carrying valuable goods through their land. Now draw another line from Poverty Point to the soapstone quarries of the Appalachian Mountains in Georgia, and the Carolinas, another 1,000 miles in the opposite direction. Draw lines to the flint quarries of Indiana and Ohio. Draw lines to the magnetite sources in Arkansas, and the galena deposits in Missouri, and the crystal quartz sources in the Ouachita Mountains. Each of these lines represents a sustained trading relationship, maintained over decades or centuries, involving the movement of raw materials over distances that would challenge a modern backpacker with GPS and freeze-dried food, accomplished by people in dugout canoes and on foot through trackless forest. The logistics are staggering. Someone at Poverty Point wanted copper. Someone 1,000 miles away at Lake Superior had copper. Between them lay 1,000 miles of wilderness, rivers, forests, swamps, other peoples, other territories, other languages. And yet the copper arrived. It arrived in quantities large enough to be fashioned into beads and pendants, and tools that archaeologists have found at the site. How did this work? We do not know the details, but we can guess at the outlines. It probably worked through a chain of intermediate exchanges, each community passing goods to the next along established routes, with each link in the chain adding something or taking something, so that by the time the copper reached Poverty Point it had passed through dozens of hands and travelled for months or possibly years. This is not primitive barter. This is a sophisticated economic system, governed by relationships and obligations and protocols that we can only dimly perceive through the archaeological record. The people who managed this trade were not simple hunter-gatherers stumbling through the woods. They were diplomats, negotiators, navigators, and entrepreneurs, people who understood the value of goods, the geography of the continent, and the social networks that made long-distance exchange possible. Now I want you to hold both images in your mind at the same time: the Great Pyramid of Giza, gleaming white in the Egyptian desert, and Poverty Point, its 6 concentric ridges and its massive bird mound rising from the Louisiana bluff above the Mississippi. Both built around 1600 to 1200 BC, depending on which dates you accept for Poverty Point, though some researchers push the dates earlier. Both requiring the coordinated labour of thousands, both reflecting a sophisticated understanding of geometry and engineering. Both built by societies that were capable of organising human effort on a monumental scale, and both completely unknown to each other, separated by an ocean that neither of them knew how to cross. The Egyptians did not know that North America existed. The people of Poverty Point did not know that Egypt existed. They were 2 branches of the same human family, separated by water and time and geography, independently arriving at the same conclusion: that the proper response to the mystery of being alive is to build something enormous and enduring and beautiful, something that reshapes the landscape itself into a statement of who you are and what you believe. That is not a coincidence. That is human nature. Let me tell you about the timeline in more detail now, because when you lay the 2 stories side by side, the parallels are almost eerie, and the gaps in what we are taught become painfully obvious. Around 3000 BC, while Egypt is unifying under its first pharaohs and developing the hieroglyphic writing system that will record its history for 3000 years, the people of North America are developing their own systems of knowledge, systems that are not written down but that are encoded in the landscape itself, in the orientation of mounds and the alignment of ridges and the geometry of earthworks that reflect the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars. They are watching the same sky that the Egyptians are watching. They are tracking the same solstices and equinoxes. They are using the same sun and the same stars to orient their constructions. The difference is that the Egyptians wrote it down and the North Americans did not, which means that everything we know about the North American side of this story has to be read from the archaeology, from the dirt and the artifacts and the shapes of the mounds themselves, and that is harder and slower and less certain than reading a hieroglyphic inscription. But the knowledge was there, the sophistication was there, the genius was there. It was just expressed differently. Around 2600 BC, while the Egyptians are in the middle of their Great Pyramid building age, the 4th dynasty, constructing the pyramids at Giza and the Sphinx, and the solar temples and the causeways and the mortuary complexes that make the Giza Plateau one of the most impressive concentrations of monumental architecture anywhere on Earth, the people of North America are continuing to build their own monuments. The mound-building tradition of the lower Mississippi Valley is flourishing. Sites like Caney Mounds and Frenchman's Bend and Hedgepeth Mounds are being constructed or expanded, each one representing a community's investment of labour and time and collective purpose in reshaping the landscape. These sites are not as large as the Great Pyramid, but they are not small either, and they are being built by people with far fewer resources, no metal tools, no wheel, no draft animals, no written engineering plans, just human muscle and woven baskets, and a vision of what the finished product should look like. And there are far more of them than most people realize. The lower Mississippi Valley alone contains hundreds of mound sites dating from the Archaic period, and when you zoom out to include the entire eastern half of North America, the number climbs into the thousands. There are an estimated 100,000 mounds in the Ohio Valley alone. 100,000. Some are small, barely visible bumps in a farmer's field. Others are massive structures rivaling anything in the ancient world. Taken together, they represent one of the most sustained traditions of monumental construction in human history, a tradition that spans over 5,000 years, from Watson Break in 3500 BC to the last Mississippian mounds built in the 1500s AD, longer than the entire history of Pharaonic Egypt. 5,000 years of building in earth. 5,000 years of communities deciding, generation after generation, that the proper way to honour their dead, mark their territory, encode their knowledge, and express their identity was to move earth, to pick it up and carry it, and shape it into forms that would endure. The sheer persistence of this tradition, its survival across millennia of climate change and cultural transformation and population movement, suggests something deep and fundamental about the relationship between these people and their landscape, a relationship that we are only beginning to understand. Around 2000 BC, while Egypt is entering what historians call the Middle Kingdom, a period of political consolidation and cultural flowering that produces some of the finest literature and art of the ancient world, North America is entering a period of transformation that will reshape the continent. Agriculture is beginning to take hold. Not the intensive grain agriculture of Egypt and Mesopotamia, but a different kind, a North American kind, based on a suite of plants that are native to the eastern woodlands: sunflower, marsh elder, goosefoot, squash, and eventually maize, which will arrive from Mexico over the centuries and eventually become the dominant crop of the continent. The adoption of agriculture in North America is not a sudden revolution. It is a slow process, centuries long, in which people who have been gathering wild plants for thousands of years gradually begin to tend and cultivate the most useful ones, selecting for larger seeds and more productive plants generation after generation until the wild ancestors are transformed into something recognizably domesticated. This process is happening independently in North America. The people of the eastern woodlands are not learning agriculture from anyone else. They are inventing it themselves, just as the people of Mesopotamia and Egypt and China and Mesoamerica invented it independently in their own regions. North America is one of the handful of places on Earth where agriculture was independently developed, and that fact alone should tell you everything you need to know about the sophistication of the people who lived there. Let me explain what independent invention of agriculture means, because it is one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, and it happened only a handful of times anywhere on the planet. Agriculture was independently invented in Mesopotamia, in China, in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, in New Guinea, in sub-Saharan Africa, and in eastern North America. That is it. Every other agricultural tradition in the world was borrowed or adapted from one of these original centers of invention. The people of eastern North America looked at the wild plants growing around them, the sunflower and the marsh elder and the goosefoot and the squash and the little barley, and over a period of centuries they began to cultivate them, selecting for the traits they wanted: larger seeds, more productive plants, easier harvest, and gradually transforming wild plants into domesticated crops that bore little resemblance to their wild ancestors. This is the same process that transformed wild wheat into the bread wheat of Egypt and Mesopotamia, that transformed wild rice into the staple crop of China, that transformed wild teosinte into the maize of Mexico. It is one of the most consequential things that human beings have ever done, the foundation of every civilization that has ever existed, and the people of eastern North America did it on their own, without any instruction or example from anyone else. The Eastern Agricultural Complex, as archaeologists call it, is centered on the river valleys of the Midwest and Southeast, particularly the Ohio, Tennessee, and Mississippi drainages, where rich alluvial soils and abundant rainfall create ideal conditions for cultivation. By 2000 BC, the people of these valleys are growing sunflowers with seed heads much larger than their wild relatives, goosefoot with seeds that are significantly larger and thinner coated than wild goosefoot, and squash that has been selected for its edible flesh rather than its hard shell. These are not wild plants that happen to grow near human settlements. They are domesticated plants that have been deliberately modified through generations of selective cultivation. The people who did this were plant geneticists, even though they would not have used that term. They understood, through practical experience accumulated over centuries, that if you plant the seeds from the biggest sunflower heads, you get bigger sunflower heads next year and the year after that and the year after that, until your sunflowers have seed heads the size of dinner plates, nothing like the small wispy flowers that grow wild in the prairies. This is science. This is technology. This is the foundation of civilization, and it happened in the river valleys of what is now Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and Illinois, at the same time that the Egyptians were perfecting their own agricultural system on the banks of the Nile. Around 1500 BC, while Egypt is in the middle of the New Kingdom, the age of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, and Ramesses II, the age of the Valley of the Kings, and the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, North America is seeing the rise of new traditions and new ways of life. The poverty point culture is at or near its peak, and its influence can be seen across the eastern United States in the distribution of its distinctive trade goods and artifact styles. Other cultures are emerging in different parts of the continent. In the southwest, the ancestors of the Puebloan peoples are beginning to develop the agricultural and architectural traditions that will eventually produce the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde and the great houses of Chaco Canyon. On the Great Plains, bison hunting cultures are developing sophisticated communal hunting techniques, driving herds over cliffs and into corrals in organized drives that require the coordination of dozens or hundreds of people across miles of open grassland. On the Pacific coast, maritime cultures are developing that will eventually produce the great fishing civilizations of the northwest coast, with their cedar longhouses and their totem poles and their potlatch ceremonies, and their social hierarchies as complex as anything in the Old World. In the Arctic, the ancestors of the Inuit are perfecting the technologies that allow human beings to live in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Kayaks and umiaks and toggling harpoons and snow houses and clothing made from animal skins sewn so tightly that they are waterproof and windproof. Technologies so effective that they remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years because they could not be improved upon. Think about what this means. In 1500 BC, while the Egyptians are carving the temples of Karnak from solid rock and filling them with gold and lapis lazuli, the people of the Arctic are creating technologies that are so perfectly adapted to their environment that they will endure, unchanged, for 3,000 years. 3,000 years! The kayak that an Inuit hunter uses in 1800 AD is essentially identical to the kayak used by his ancestors in 1500 BC. The toggling harpoon head, with its ingenious pivot mechanism that turns sideways under the skin of a marine mammal to prevent it from pulling free, is a design so effective that modern marine biologists have studied it as a model of engineering elegance. The snow house, built from blocks of wind-packed snow arranged in a rising spiral, is a masterpiece of structural engineering that creates a warm, windproof shelter from the most abundant material in the Arctic environment, using nothing more than a snow knife and the knowledge of how snow behaves under compression. These are not simple tools made by simple people. These are the products of thousands of years of refinement, of trial and error, and accumulated wisdom passed from generation to generation, of a civilization that expressed its genius not in monuments, but in the perfection of the tools and techniques that kept its people alive in conditions that would kill an unequipped European in hours. The Arctic is the ultimate test of human adaptability, and the people who lived there passed that test so completely that their solutions became the standard by which all subsequent Arctic technology would be measured. Meanwhile, in the forests of the eastern woodlands, another development is underway that will have enormous consequences for the future of the continent. The woodland period, as archaeologists call it, is seeing the spread of pottery technology throughout the eastern half of North America. Pottery, which first appears in the southeast around 2500 BC, is gradually adopted by communities further north and west, and by 1500 BC it is becoming common in the river valleys of the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. The spread of pottery is important because it changes the way people cook and store food. Clay pots can be placed directly on a fire, unlike the animal hide containers and woven baskets that had to be heated by dropping hot stones into them. Clay pots can store liquids. Clay pots can be sealed to keep out insects and rodents. The adoption of pottery is one of those quiet technological revolutions that does not make for dramatic storytelling, but that fundamentally changes the way people live. The same way the adoption of the refrigerator changed the way modern Americans live, not by being dramatic, but by being useful, day after day, meal after meal, year after year. And the pottery that the eastern woodlands people are making is not crude. Even the earliest examples show a skill and an aesthetic sensibility that speaks to a people who care about the quality and the beauty of their household goods. The pots are decorated with stamped and incised patterns, geometric designs pressed into the wet clay before firing that are distinctive to different communities and different time periods. A ceramic vocabulary that archaeologists can read like a language, tracking the movement of ideas and people across the continent by the patterns on their cooking pots. None of these developments make it into the standard timeline of human civilization. The timeline you learned in school goes Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, modern world. North America does not appear in that timeline until 1492 when Columbus arrives and history supposedly begins. Everything before that is lumped into a vague category called prehistory, as if the people who lived on this continent for 15,000 years before Columbus was simply waiting in the dark for real history to start. This is not just wrong. It is one of the greatest distortions in the way we teach the human past, and tonight we're going to correct it, story by story, century by century, mound by mound. But first, I want to take a moment to explain why the distortion exists, because the reasons are interesting, and they tell you something important about how history is made and who gets to tell it. When European colonists arrived in North America in the 1500s and 1600s, they found the mounds. They could not miss them. The mounds of the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Valley were enormous, visible features of the landscape, some of them covered with trees that were hundreds of years old, some of them still used by indigenous communities for ceremonies and burials. The colonists saw the mounds and they asked the obvious question, who built them? And here is where the story takes a dark turn. The European colonists, by and large, refused to believe that the ancestors of the indigenous peoples they were displacing and killing had built the mounds. The mounds were too large, too sophisticated, too impressive to have been built by the people the colonists were calling savages. So they invented an alternative explanation. They invented the myth of the mound builders, a lost race of civilized people, sometimes identified as the lost tribes of Israel, sometimes as ancient Phoenicians or Egyptians or Welshmen or Vikings, who had built the mounds and then been destroyed or driven away by the ancestors of the present-day Native Americans. This myth served a useful purpose for the colonists. If the mounds had been built by a lost civilization that was destroyed by the Indians, then the Indians were not just primitive but destructive, enemies of civilization who had wiped out a superior culture that came before them. And if that was the case, then the European colonists were not invaders. They were restorers, reclaiming the continent from the people who had stolen it from its rightful civilized inhabitants. The mound builder myth was propaganda, a story told to justify the dispossession and destruction of the people who actually built the mounds, and it persisted in American popular culture for over a century, until the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology, under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, published a definitive report in 1894 demonstrating conclusively that the mounds were built by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples who still lived in the region. The science was clear. The mounds were Native American. The mound builder myth was dead, at least in academic circles. But the damage was done. The erasure of North American civilization from the popular understanding of history had already taken hold, and it has never been fully corrected. Most Americans today, if asked to name the great civilizations of the ancient world, will list Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, and maybe Mesopotamia. Almost none of them will mention Cahokia or Poverty Point or the Hopewell or Chaco Canyon. The parallel timeline of North American civilization remains invisible, hidden in plain sight, its monuments standing in fields and forests across the continent, visited by almost no one, known by almost no one, a story that is waiting to be told to an audience that does not know it needs to hear it. Until tonight. Let me take you to Poverty Point now, properly, because I have been giving you facts and numbers and I want to give you the experience. I want you to close your eyes and imagine what it would have felt like to stand at Poverty Point 3,000 years ago, when the site was alive and occupied and full of people. You're standing on the outermost ridge of the concentric semicircles, the highest point of the residential area, and you're looking inward toward the centre. Below you, the ridges step down like the rows of an enormous amphitheatre, each one about 5 feet lower than the last, each one about 140 feet apart, each one curving in a graceful arc toward the river. On the ridges, you can see houses, small structures made of wooden posts and wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs, clustered in groups along the raised earthen platforms. Smoke rises from cooking fires. You can smell fish roasting and nuts toasting, and the particular sweet, sharp smell of clay cooking balls being heated in open fires. Dozens of fires visible along the ridges, each one attended by people going about the ordinary business of a late afternoon. The sound carries in the still air. You can hear children. You can hear someone singing. You can hear the rhythmic thud of someone processing seeds in a stone mortar, a sound so old and so universal that it is the heartbeat of every agricultural and pre-agricultural society that has ever existed. Beyond the innermost ridge, the ground drops away to the floodplain, and beyond that, the river. Not the Mississippi itself, but a bayou or tributary, brown and slow and wide, lined with cypress and tupelo trees draped in Spanish moss, and the river is busy with canoes, dugout canoes carved from single logs, some of them 30 or 40 feet long, and the canoes are carrying things, bundles of goods, baskets of food, raw materials for trade, because Poverty Point is not just a settlement, it is a hub, a central node in a trade network that stretches across half a continent, and the canoes on the river are its arteries. Now turn around. Look west, toward the river bluff behind you, and there it is. Mound A, the Bird Mound. 72 feet of packed earth rising from the bluff top like a man-made mountain, its wings spread, its head facing the river, enormous and unmistakable and intentional. The late afternoon sun catches it from the side, throwing the western slope into golden light and the eastern slope into deep shadow, and the sheer scale of it makes you catch your breath, because you know, looking at it, that every ounce of that earth was carried here on human backs, basket by basket, load by load, up the slope of the bluff and onto the growing mound. Thousands of people working together to build something that they would never finish in their lifetimes, but that their children and their grandchildren would complete. That is what civilization looks like. It does not require pyramids of cut stone. It does not require hieroglyphics or pharaohs or bronze tools or wheeled carts. It requires a community that can see beyond the present, that can imagine something that does not yet exist and work together across generations to bring it into being. The people of Poverty Point had that. They had it 3,000 years ago in the forests of Louisiana, while the pharaohs were building their pyramids on the other side of the world, and the experience of being at Poverty Point was not just visual. Let me walk you deeper into the sensory world of this place. The air in northeastern Louisiana is thick, warm and wet, even in autumn when the worst of the summer heat has broken. It smells of river mud and cypress bark and fish, and the sharp green smell of growing things, the kind of rich organic smell that tells you the land is alive and productive, that it produces more food than you can eat, and more beauty than you can take in. The bayous around the site are covered with lily pads and duckweed, and the water is brown and slow and full of life. Catfish and gaur sliding through the shadows beneath overhanging willows, turtles basking on every log, herons standing motionless in the shallows waiting for fish. The air is full of birds. In autumn, the Mississippi Flyway, the great migration corridor that funnels millions of birds from the breeding grounds of Canada to the wintering grounds of the Gulf Coast, passes directly over this part of Louisiana, and the sky would have been dark with ducks and geese and cranes flying in just enormous V formations that stretched from horizon to horizon, their calls filling the air with a wild music that meant food and feathers and the turning of the season. The people of Poverty Point lived in one of the richest environments in North America. The Mississippi River floodplain is one of the most productive ecosystems on the continent, a vast expanse of bottomland forest and swamp and bayou and oxbow lake that produces fish and shellfish and waterfowl and game and nuts and roots and fruits in quantities that are almost difficult to believe if you have not seen them. The abundance is the key to understanding Poverty Point. These people did not need agriculture because the natural world around them produced more food than agriculture could. They had stumbled into a garden that grew itself, and they had the wisdom to recognize it and to organize their society around harvesting and managing its bounty rather than trying to replace it with planted fields. This is not a failure to invent agriculture. This is a choice, a rational and informed choice, to work with the landscape rather than against it, to harvest the wealth that the river provides rather than trying to create wealth through the back-breaking labour of farming. It is a different path to civilization, a path that the rest of the world did not take, but that worked brilliantly in the specific environment of the lower Mississippi Valley for thousands of years. Now let me tell you something that will change the way you think about the construction of Poverty Point. Recent research using core samples and soil analysis suggests that Mound A, the massive bird mound, may have been built in a single concentrated building campaign lasting as little as 90 days. Not decades, not centuries, 90 days. If this is true, and the evidence is strong though not yet universally accepted, it implies an organizational achievement that is almost without parallel in the ancient world. Building a mound 72 feet tall and 700 feet long in 90 days would require a workforce of thousands of people working in coordinated shifts, hauling earth from borrow pits to the mound site in a continuous stream of baskets, day after day, for 3 months straight. The logistics of feeding and housing and coordinating this workforce are staggering. You need to feed thousands of people every day. You need to organize them into work groups. You need to manage the flow of earth from multiple borrow pits to the growing mound. You need to keep the workers motivated and the construction on track, And you need to do all of this without writing, without a formal government, without any of the administrative infrastructure that the Egyptians used to manage the construction of the Great Pyramid. If the 90-day hypothesis is correct, then the construction of Mound A at Poverty Point is one of the great organizational achievements of the ancient world, comparable in its logistical complexity to the construction of the pyramids, accomplished by people with far fewer resources and far less technological capability. Let me walk you through more of the parallel timeline, because it continues, century after century, on both sides of the Atlantic, and the further you go, the more remarkable it becomes. Around 1000 BC, while Egypt is in decline, weakened by invasions and internal division, entering the third intermediate period that will see the once mighty kingdom fragmented into competing power centers, North America is experiencing something very different. The continent is in a period of creative ferment. New technologies are spreading. Pottery, which appeared in the southeastern United States as early as 2500 BC, making it among the oldest pottery traditions in the Americas, is becoming more widespread and more sophisticated. The bow and arrow, which will eventually replace the atlatl as the primary hunting weapon, is beginning to appear. Agriculture is expanding, with sunflower and goosefoot and squash being cultivated in the river valleys of the Midwest and Southeast, and a new cultural tradition is emerging in the Ohio River Valley that will produce some of the most spectacular earthworks in the ancient world. This is the beginning of what archaeologists call the Adena culture, named after an estate in Ohio where the first artifacts were identified, and it marks the start of a 1,000-year tradition of mound building and earthwork construction in the Ohio Valley that will culminate in the Hopewell tradition, one of the most remarkable cultural achievements in the history of North America. The Adena people built conical burial mounds, sometimes quite large, over the graves of their dead. They lined these graves with logs and bark and placed the bodies inside with elaborate grave goods, copper bracelets and beads and gorgets, carved stone pipes, sheets of mica cut into shapes, ornaments made from exotic materials that had been traded from hundreds or thousands of miles away. The Adena mounds are not as large as the mounds at Poverty Point, but they represent something new, a formalization of the relationship between the living and the dead, a commitment to honoring the departed with monumental construction that mirrors, in its own way, the Egyptian obsession with tombs and the afterlife that produced the pyramids and the Valley of the Kings. Both cultures are building for the dead. Both are investing enormous resources in the construction of monuments that serve no practical purpose except to honor and house the deceased. Both believe that the dead deserve more than a simple grave, that they deserve a mountain, a house of earth or stone that will stand for centuries as a testament to their importance and to the love and respect of the community that built it. The parallels are not identical, but they rhyme. The Adena culture is also producing some of the earliest evidence of long-distance trade in the Ohio Valley. Adena burial mounds contain artifacts made from materials that originate hundreds of miles away: copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians, indicating that even in this relatively early period, the people of the Ohio Valley were connected to trade networks that spanned much of eastern North America. The Adena are also the first people in the Ohio Valley to cultivate the suite of native plants that constitute the eastern agricultural complex: sunflower, goosefoot, marsh elder, and squash, supplementing their hunting and gathering with small-scale agriculture that gradually becomes more important over the centuries. And they are making something else that tells you about the richness of their inner life. They are carving tobacco pipes. The Adena tubular pipe is one of the distinctive artifacts of the culture, a straight tube of stone, sometimes carved into the form of a human figure or an animal, designed for smoking tobacco, which the Adena cultivated and used in ceremonies. Tobacco is a sacred plant in many Native American traditions, and its use in ritual contexts goes back thousands of years in eastern North America. The act of smoking, of drawing the smoke into the body and exhaling it toward the sky, is not recreational, it is ceremonial. It is a way of communicating with the spirit world, of sending prayers upward with the smoke, of establishing connections between the human realm and the supernatural realm. The pipes the Adena carved for this purpose are beautiful objects, smooth and polished and sometimes elaborately decorated, and they represent one of the earliest artistic traditions in the Ohio Valley, a tradition that will reach its full flowering in the spectacular carved effigy pipes of the Hopewell period. pipes in the shape of birds and animals and humans that are among the masterpieces of ancient American art. The transition from Adena to Hopewell is not a sharp break. It is a gradual intensification of trends that were already present in Adena culture: more elaborate earthworks, more extensive trade networks, more sophisticated art, more complex ceremonial practices. By around 200 BC, the Hopewell tradition is fully established in the Ohio Valley, and it is spreading its influence across the eastern half of the continent through the exchange network that archaeologists call the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, one of the most remarkable cultural phenomena in the ancient Americas. They rhyme in the way that all human civilizations rhyme when they grapple with the same fundamental questions: where do we come from, where are we going, and what do we owe the dead? And the rhyming extends beyond the treatment of the dead. Both the Egyptians and the ancient North Americans are obsessed with the sky. The Great Pyramid of Giza is oriented to the cardinal directions with astonishing precision, its sides aligned to true north within a fraction of a degree. The pyramid's internal passages are aligned with specific stars, including the North Star and stars in the constellation of Orion, which the Egyptians associated with the god Osiris and the afterlife. The entire structure is a machine for connecting the dead pharaoh to the cosmos, a stone bridge between the earth and the sky. The mound builders of North America are doing the same thing in a different medium. The concentric ridges of Poverty Point are oriented to the spring and fall equinox sunrise. The Newark earthworks track the lunar cycle. Cahokia's Woodhenge marks the solstices. The Great Serpent Mound's head aligns with the summer solstice sunset. Across thousands of years and thousands of miles, the people of ancient North America are building structures that connect the earth to the sky, that encode the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars in the geometry of the landscape, that create a permanent record of astronomical knowledge in a medium, Earth, that will endure for millennia. The impulse is identical to the Egyptian impulse. The materials are different. The scale is sometimes different. But the underlying intellectual project, the determination to understand the cosmos, and to embed that understanding in architecture, is the same. When you look up at the stars tonight, you're looking at the same sky that the pyramid builders and the mound builders both studied with equal intensity and equal reverence. And both groups left their observations written in the landscape for you to find, if only you know where to look. Around 500 BC, while the ancient world is in the midst of what the philosopher Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age, the period when Greek philosophy and Buddhism and Confucianism and Zoroastrianism are all emerging simultaneously in different parts of the Old World, North America is entering its own period of extraordinary creativity. The Adena tradition is evolving into the Hopewell tradition, and the Hopewell are about to create something that the world has never seen. The Hopewell Interaction Sphere, as archaeologists call it, is not an empire, it is not a kingdom, it is not a political entity at all, at least not in any way that Old World categories can easily describe. It is a vast network of exchange, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, through which exotic materials and finished goods and ideas and artistic styles flow like blood through a circulatory system. Obsidian from Yellowstone 2,000 miles to the west, copper from the shores of Lake Superior, silver from Ontario, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, shark teeth and marine shells from the Gulf Coast, grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, galena from the upper Mississippi. These materials move across the continent through a network of exchange relationships that connect hundreds of communities across thousands of miles, and at the nodes of this network, at the places where the exchange is densest and the wealth is greatest. The Hopewell build earthworks that are among the most geometrically precise constructions in the ancient world. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, built by the Hopewell around 100 BC to 400 AD, cover more than 4 square miles and include a perfect circle over 1,000 feet in diameter, connected by parallel walls to a perfect octagon that is even larger. The precision of these geometric forms is remarkable. The Great Circle at Newark is so close to a mathematically perfect circle that the deviation is less than could be achieved by modern surveyors using standard equipment. The octagon incorporates alignments with the 18.6-year cycle of the Moon, the longest astronomical cycle that can be tracked with the naked eye, which means the Hopewell were not just building big, they were building with a mathematical and astronomical sophistication that is genuinely astonishing. Let me say that again because it deserves emphasis. The Hopewell earthworks at Newark, Ohio incorporate precise alignments with an astronomical cycle that takes nearly 19 years to complete. That means someone had to observe and record the movements of the moon for at least 19 years, probably much longer, to identify the pattern and then encode it in the geometry of the earthworks. This is not primitive. This is science. This is long-term, systematic observation of the natural world, combined with advanced geometry and engineering, all carried out by a society that had no writing, no metal tools, and no wheel. They did it with memory and oral tradition and baskets of earth, and wooden stakes, and stretched cords, and an understanding of mathematics that we are only beginning to appreciate. And the earthworks at Newark are not the only Hopewell site that demonstrates this level of sophistication. The Hopewell built hundreds of earthworks across Ohio, Indiana, and the surrounding states, and many of them incorporate precise geometric forms, circles, squares, octagons, and parallel walls that extend for miles across the landscape. The Highbank Works near Chillicothe, Ohio is another circle and octagon combination that mirrors the Newark site so closely that archaeologists believe both were built using the same unit of measurement, a standard Hopewell measurement that was applied consistently across sites separated by 60 miles. That implies not just mathematical knowledge, but standardization, a shared system of measurement used by different communities in different places, the same kind of standardization that the Egyptians used when they built with the royal cubit. The Hopewell were not just builders, they were artists of the highest order. The artifacts found in Hopewell burial mounds are among the most beautiful objects ever created in the ancient Americas. Sheets of mica, a translucent mineral that splits into paper-thin layers, were cut into the shapes of human hands, bird talons, serpents, and geometric forms with a precision that suggests the use of templates or patterns. Copper, hammered from native copper nuggets into thin sheets without any smelting or casting, was fashioned into elaborate headdresses, breastplates, ear spools, and cut-out silhouettes of falcons and bears and fish that are breathtaking in their artistry and their technical skill. Freshwater pearls, thousands of them, were drilled and strung into necklaces and sewn onto clothing in intricate patterns. Obsidian from Yellowstone was flaked into enormous ceremonial blades, some of them over a foot long, so thin that light passes through them, objects that are far too large and too delicate to be practical tools, and that must have served a purely ceremonial or symbolic purpose. These are not the products of a primitive culture. These are the products of a civilization with specialized craftspeople, established trade networks, shared artistic traditions, and a rich ceremonial life that demanded the finest materials and the finest workmanship. The Hopewell burial mounds themselves tell a story of elaborate ritual and deep respect for the dead. When an important person died, the Hopewell built a wooden charnel house over the body, filled it with grave goods, set the whole structure on fire, and then covered the ashes and the offerings with a mound of earth that could be 20 or 30 feet high and hundreds of feet in diameter. The grave goods in some Hopewell burials are staggering in their quantity and their quality. One burial at the Hopewell Mound Group in Ohio contained over 100 pounds of obsidian, thousands of freshwater pearls, copper ornaments, mica cutouts, carved stone pipes, and artifacts made from materials gathered from across the continent. The investment of wealth in a single burial rivals anything found in the tombs of Egyptian nobles, and while the Hopewell did not build in stone, the care and the reverence with which they treated their dead speaks to the same fundamental human impulse that drove the Egyptians to build the Valley of the Kings. While the Greeks are developing formal geometry, and the Chinese are refining their astronomical observations, and the Indians are developing the number system that will eventually give the world the concept of zero, the Hopewell of Ohio are doing their own version of the same thing, independently, on the other side of the planet, and encoding their knowledge not in written text but in the landscape itself, in earthworks so large that they can only be fully appreciated from the air, from a vantage point that the builders themselves never had. And perhaps the most haunting of all these earthworks is the Great Serpent Mound, a quarter-mile-long effigy of a serpent built on a hilltop in southern Ohio, its body undulating in 7 graceful curves along the ridge, its mouth open as if swallowing an oval object, usually interpreted as an egg or the sun. The Great Serpent Mound is the largest effigy mound in the world, and its dating is debated, with some evidence pointing to the Adena period and other evidence suggesting a later Fort Ancient attribution. But regardless of exactly when it was built, it represents one of the most ambitious and most beautiful works of landscape art ever created by any culture anywhere. The serpent is not visible as a serpent from the ground. You can walk its length and see the curves and the ridges, but the full form, the complete image of the serpent swallowing the sun, only becomes apparent from above. The builders designed it to be seen by the sky, or perhaps by the spirits they believed inhabited the sky, and they shaped an entire hilltop into a work of art that would endure for millennia. Walk the length of the Great Serpent Mound, and you walk a quarter of a mile along the back of a creature that someone imagined into existence over 1,000 years ago, carried into being basket by basket, load by load, until the hilltop itself became the serpent, until the land and the art were inseparable, until the boundary between the natural and the made dissolved completely. That is not primitive. That is visionary. That is land art on a scale that modern artists like Robert Smithson and Michael Heiser would not attempt until the 20th century, and they did it with bulldozers and dump trucks. The people of ancient Ohio did it with woven baskets and bare hands. Ohio alone contains more ancient earthworks than any comparable area on Earth. Fort Ancient, another hilltop enclosure, has walls that extend for over 3 miles along the edge of a plateau above the Little Miami River. The Mound City Group, near Chillicothe, is a ceremonial complex of 23 mounds enclosed within a rectangular earthen wall. The Miamisburg Mound, the largest conical mound in Ohio, rises nearly 70 feet from a hilltop and contains an estimated 54,000 cubic yards of earth, all of it placed by hand. These sites are not isolated curiosities. They are the visible remnants of a civilization that transformed the landscape of the Ohio Valley on a scale that is genuinely comparable to what the Egyptians did to the Nile Valley. And they did it with none of the advantages that the Egyptians possessed. No metal tools, no wheel, no writing, no centralized state authority. They did it because they chose to, because their understanding of the world demanded it, because the geometry of the earth and the movements of the sky required a response in dirt and labor and human will. Around 1 AD, the year that Western civilization uses as the dividing line of its calendar, the Roman Empire is at or near its peak, controlling the entire Mediterranean world and much of Western Europe. Egypt has been absorbed into the Roman Empire, its last pharaoh, Cleopatra, dead for 30 years. The Great Pyramid is already 2,500 years old, and it is a tourist attraction, visited by Roman travellers who marvel at its age and its size the same way modern tourists do. And in North America, the Hopewell interaction sphere is at its peak. The earthworks at Newark and other Ohio Valley sites are being built and expanded, and the trade networks are carrying exotic goods across the continent in quantities that they have never reached before and will never reach again until the Mississippian period 1,000 years later. The scale of the Hopewell exchange network at its peak is genuinely continental. A single Hopewell burial site might contain copper from Michigan, obsidian from Wyoming, mica from North Carolina, shark teeth from Florida, silver from Ontario, and marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico. These materials have travelled a combined distance of thousands of miles to converge on a single burial in a single mound in Ohio, and each item represents a chain of human relationships, negotiations, reciprocal obligations, and ceremonial exchanges that connected communities across a quarter of a continent. The Hopewell did not have roads in the Roman sense. They did not have a postal system or a merchant fleet or a standing army that could enforce trade agreements. What they had was something more subtle and in some ways more impressive, a network of social relationships maintained through the exchange of prestige goods, a web of alliances and friendships and kinship ties, and ceremonial partnerships that kept materials and ideas and artistic styles flowing across the continent for centuries. The Roman Empire maintained its trade networks through military force, taxation, and a system of roads and ports built by slave labour. The Hopewell maintained theirs through mutual respect, reciprocal generosity, and the shared understanding that the exchange of beautiful and exotic objects was not just commerce but ceremony, not just economics but religion. The materials themselves were sacred. Copper was not just a useful metal. It was a substance with spiritual properties, associated with the underworld, with water, with transformation. Mica was not just a shiny mineral. It was a mirror, a window between worlds, a substance that could be shaped into the form of a hand, or a claw, or a serpent, and placed in a grave to accompany the dead on their journey to the next world. Obsidian was not just a good material for making blades. It was volcanic glass, born from fire, black and sharp and beautiful, and the enormous ceremonial blades the Hopewell made from it were not tools. They were offerings objects of such beauty and such obvious impracticality that they could only have been intended for the eyes of the dead and the spirits. Every object in a Hopewell burial mound is a story. Every piece of copper tells a story of a journey from the shores of Lake Superior to the river valleys of Ohio. Every shark tooth tells a story of a journey from the warm waters of the Gulf to a cold burial chamber in the frozen earth. Every sheet of mica tells a story of hands that shaped it, eyes that admired it, ceremonies that consecrated it, and a grave that received it. The Hopewell world is a world of stories, and the objects are the language in which those stories are told. But the Hopewell are not the only story in North America around 1 AD. Far to the southwest, in the desert of what is now New Mexico and Arizona, another tradition is emerging. The ancestors of the Puebloan peoples, sometimes called the ancestral Puebloans, or by the older term Anasazi, are beginning to build permanent structures of stone and adobe in the canyons and mesas of the Four Corners region. These early structures are simple, pit houses dug into the ground with timber and earth roofs. But over the centuries they will evolve into some of the most remarkable architecture in the ancient world. The multi-story apartment complexes of Chaco Canyon, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the great kivas that are the largest ceremonial structures in North America. The Puebloan tradition is different from the mound-building tradition of the East. It is built in stone, not earth. It is adapted to the desert, not the forest. It solves different problems: water management in an arid landscape, defense against raiders, the need to store food through long dry seasons. But it is no less impressive, no less sophisticated, no less worthy of being placed alongside the great building traditions of the Old World, and its ultimate expression, Chaco Canyon, deserves a moment of your attention, because Chaco is one of the most astonishing places in North America and one of the most mysterious. Chaco Canyon is a shallow valley in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, about 6,000 feet above sea level, dry and hot in summer, freezing in winter, with less than 9 inches of rainfall a year. It is, by most standards, one of the last places on Earth where you would expect to find a major centre of civilization. And yet between roughly 850 and 1150 AD, the people of Chaco Canyon built something extraordinary. They built great houses, massive multi-story stone buildings containing hundreds of rooms, arranged in precise D-shaped and L-shaped plans around central plazas. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, contains over 600 rooms and rises 4 stories high, its walls built from hundreds of thousands of carefully shaped sandstone blocks fitted together with a precision that rivals Roman masonry. Pueblo Bonito is the largest building in North America until the construction of apartment buildings in New York City in the 1880s. Let me say that again. The largest building in North America for nearly 1,000 years was a stone complex built by Puebloan people in the desert of New Mexico. The great houses of Chaco Canyon are connected to each other and to outlying communities by a network of roads that stretch across the desert in perfectly straight lines, some of them extending for over 30 miles. These roads are not worn paths. They are engineered features, cut into the bedrock and bordered by low walls of masonry, 30 feet wide, far wider than any practical road would need to be for a culture without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. The roads are ceremonial. They are symbolic. They connect the great houses of Chaco to a network of over 150 outlying communities scattered across the San Juan Basin, creating a web of relationships and obligations that archaeologists call the Chaco system. The great houses of Chaco also incorporate precise astronomical alignments. The famous sun dagger at Fajada Butte, a spiral petroglyph that is bisected by a dagger of sunlight at the summer solstice, is the most dramatic example. But the buildings themselves are oriented to mark solstices and equinoxes, and the 18.6-year lunar cycle, the same cycle that the Hopewell encoded in the Newark earthworks 2,000 miles to the east. The Puebloan astronomers of Chaco and the Hopewell astronomers of Ohio were tracking the same celestial events, independently using different methods, encoding their knowledge in different materials, stone walls in the desert and earthen embankments in the forest, but arriving at the same fundamental understanding of the movements of the heavens, and then Chaco was abandoned. Like Cahokia, like so many of the great centres of ancient North America, Chaco Canyon was left empty, its great houses standing silent in the desert, its roads leading nowhere, its plazas filling with wind-blown sand. The people did not disappear. They moved. they dispersed into the smaller communities of the surrounding region, the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, and the Rio Grande Pueblos, peoples who carry the memory of Chaco in their oral traditions, and who consider the canyon a sacred ancestral place. And as Chaco declined, other centers rose. Mesa Verde, in southwestern Colorado, became home to one of the most visually dramatic architectural traditions in the ancient world. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are built into natural alcoves in the sandstone canyon walls, multi-story apartment complexes of stone and mortar tucked under overhanging ledges, hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. Cliff Palace, the largest of the Mesa Verde dwellings, contains over 150 rooms and 23 kivas, the circular subterranean ceremonial rooms that are the spiritual heart of Puebloan architecture. It housed an estimated 100 to 120 people, all living in a space that is essentially a small town built inside a cave, accessed by handholds and toeholds chipped into the cliff face. The engineering is remarkable. The walls are built from carefully shaped sandstone blocks laid in courses with mud mortar, and some rooms still retain their original plaster, applied smooth and painted with geometric designs in red and white and black. The kivas are perfectly circular, dug into the floor of the alcove with stone benches around the interior walls and a small hole in the floor called a sipapu, which represents the place where the ancestors emerged from the underworld into the present world. The cliff dwellings were occupied for only about a century, from roughly 1190 to 1280 AD, before being abandoned like Chaco before them, the people moving south and east to the Rio Grande Valley and the mesas of Hopi and Zuni. But in their brief century of occupation, they produced some of the most beautiful and most memorable architecture in the ancient Americas, buildings that seem to grow from the rock itself, that merge with the landscape so completely that they look like a natural feature of the canyon, a place that the earth itself decided to build. And at the same time, on the Pacific coast, the maritime cultures of the Northwest are reaching new levels of complexity. The ancestors of the Tlingit and Haida and Kwakiutl are building cedar longhouses over 100 feet long, carving the massive cedar totem poles that are among the most impressive works of art produced by any culture anywhere in the world, and developing a social and economic system based on the potlatch, the ceremonial redistribution of wealth that is as complex and as formalized as any economic system in the ancient Mediterranean. In the Arctic, the Dorset culture is thriving, producing some of the finest small-scale art in the ancient world, tiny carved figures of ivory and bone that depict humans, animals, and supernatural beings with a grace and an expressiveness that rivals the best work of any culture on Earth. The Dorset are master carvers, and their art is not primitive or crude. It is refined, sophisticated, and deeply beautiful, the work of people with a rich inner life and a complex relationship with the natural and spiritual worlds. On the Great Plains, something equally remarkable is happening. The bison hunting cultures of the plains have developed a method of communal hunting that is one of the most sophisticated cooperative endeavours in the ancient world. They are driving entire herds of bison over cliffs, a technique called a buffalo jump, that requires the coordinated effort of dozens or hundreds of people working together across miles of open grassland. The process begins days or weeks before the actual kill. Scouts locate a herd and determine its size and direction of movement. Then lines of stone cairns, called drive lanes, are prepared leading toward the cliff edge, sometimes extending for miles across the prairie in a V-shaped funnel. On the day of the drive, runners position themselves along the drive lanes hidden behind the cairns, and other runners move behind the herd, slowly, carefully, nudging the animals toward the funnel. The key is patience. Bison are skittish and will stampede in any direction if startled, so the drivers have to move them slowly, using the landscape and the wind and the natural inclination of the herd to drift in the desired direction. When the herd enters the drive lanes, the runners behind the cairns leap up, waving robes and shouting, channeling the animals toward the cliff edge, and the bison, caught in a stampede with no escape, pour over the precipice. Head smashed in buffalo jump in Alberta, one of the most famous and best-studied buffalo jump sites, was used continuously for nearly 6,000 years, and the bone bed at the base of the cliff is over 30 feet deep, representing millions of animals killed over millennia. The organisation required to execute a buffalo jump successfully is comparable to the organisation required to build a mound or a pyramid. It requires planning, leadership, coordination, specialised knowledge of animal behaviour, intimate familiarity with the landscape, and the ability to get large numbers of people to work together toward a common goal on a precise schedule. It is engineering applied to ecology, architecture applied to animal behavior, and it sustained large populations on the Great Plains for thousands of years. In the Great Lakes region, people are mining native copper from deposits in what is now Michigan, hammering the pure metal into tools, weapons, and ornaments using a technique called cold hammering that involves repeatedly heating the copper in a fire and then hammering it into shape on a stone anvil. This old copper complex, as archaeologists call it, dates back to at least 4000 BC, making it one of the oldest metalworking traditions in the world, contemporary with the earliest copper use in the Old World. The people of the Great Lakes were working with metal at the same time as the people of Mesopotamia and Egypt, independently, without any knowledge of what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. The copper they produced travelled vast distances through trade networks, appearing at sites hundreds and eventually thousands of miles from the source, and it represents one of the earliest examples of long-distance trade in a valuable commodity in the ancient Americas. This is what North America looks like while the Roman Empire controls the Mediterranean. It is not a wilderness, it is a continent of civilizations, each one adapted to its own environment, each one solving the problems of human existence in its own way, each one producing art and architecture and knowledge and social systems that are worthy of study and admiration and respect. And none of it makes it into the standard timeline of human history, because the people who wrote that timeline did not know about any of it, and by the time they found out, they had already decided that civilization was something that happened somewhere else. Let me take you forward now to the period that most directly parallels the great age of Egyptian monument building, because there is one more North American civilization that demands to be placed alongside Egypt, and it is the one that this channel has talked about before, the one that still astonishes me every time I think about it, Cahokia. But before we get to Cahokia, let me pause and tell you about what happens in the centuries between the decline of the Hopewell and the rise of the Mississippians, because this period, from roughly 400 AD to 900 AD, is often treated as a dark age in North American archaeology, a period when the great trade networks collapsed and the earthwork building tradition faded and nothing much happened. This is misleading. What actually happened is that the societies of Eastern North America were undergoing a fundamental transformation. The adoption of the bow and arrow, which replaced the atlatl as the primary hunting and warfare technology around 700 AD, changed the dynamics of hunting and defense. The spread of maize agriculture from the southwest into the eastern woodlands, which accelerated between 800 and 1000 AD, transformed the economic base of communities throughout the Midwest and Southeast, making possible the population growth and social complexity that would produce the Mississippian world. And the development of new political and religious systems, drawing on both local traditions and influences from Mesoamerica, created the ideological framework for the centralized chiefdoms that would characterize the Mississippian period. The rise of Cahokia does not come out of nowhere. It comes out of centuries of change, experimentation, and increasing complexity, a slow gathering of energy that erupts around 1050 AD in one of the most dramatic episodes of urbanization in the ancient Americas. Around 1050 AD, in the Mississippi River floodplain just across the river from present-day St. Louis, a city rises from the earth. It rises quickly in a burst of construction and population growth that transforms a modest collection of farming villages into the largest urban center north of Mexico. At its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia has a population of somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with another 20 to 30,000 living in the surrounding suburbs and satellite communities. That is comparable to London at the same time. That is larger than most European cities in the year 1100, and at the center of Cahokia stands Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in the Americas, 100 feet tall, covering over 14 acres at its base, larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza. I want you to let that sink in. Monk's Mound is larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid. It covers more ground. It contains more volume of material. It was built entirely of earth, basket load by basket load, carried on the backs of human beings without any mechanical assistance, and it was the centerpiece of a planned city that included over 100 other mounds, a grand plaza larger than 40 football fields, a wooden palisade with guard towers encircling the central precinct, and a circle of enormous wooden posts called Woodhenge that functioned as a solar calendar, marking the solstices and equinoxes with the precision of Stonehenge. Cahokia is not contemporary with the Egyptian pyramids. It is 2,000 years later. But it represents the same impulse, the same genius, the same determination to build something monumental that reshapes the landscape and announces to the world that a civilization has arrived. And like the Egyptian pyramids, Cahokia raises questions that we cannot fully answer. How was it governed? What did its people believe? Why did they build on such an enormous scale? And why did they abandon it, walking away from the greatest city in North America sometime around 1300 AD, leaving the mounds and the plazas and the palisade to the grass and the trees and the centuries of silence that followed? Let me take you inside Cahokia for a moment, because the numbers alone do not capture what this place was. Walk with me through the Grand Plaza at midday, around 1100 AD, when the city is at its peak. The plaza is enormous, 50 acres of flat open ground that has been carefully levelled and resurfaced with layers of coloured sand and clay. It is not natural. The Cahokians removed the existing topsoil, filled in the low spots, and created a perfectly flat ceremonial space that is one of the largest public plazas in the ancient world, larger than the great plazas of many Mesoamerican cities, larger than most medieval European market squares. Monk's Mound rises at the northern end of the plaza like a man-made mountain, 100 feet tall, its 4 terraces stepping upward to a flat summit where the paramount chief's residence stands, a massive timber building over 100 feet long, visible from every point in the city. The summit building is not just a house, it is a statement of power, elevated above everything else, reachable only by climbing the long stairway cut into the southern face of the mound. Standing on top of Monk's Mound, you can see the entire city spread below you, the other mounds rising from the floodplain like islands, the residential neighbourhoods stretching in every direction, the wooden palisade with its evenly spaced guard towers encircling the central precinct, the smoke from thousands of cooking fires rising into the warm river valley air. You can see the river, the Mississippi, broad and brown and slow, carrying canoes loaded with goods from communities up and down the valley. And you can see Woodhenge, the circle of enormous red cedar posts, each one over 20 feet tall and 2 feet in diameter, set in a precise circle about 400 feet across. Woodhenge is Cahokia's calendar. The posts are positioned so that when you stand at the centre of the circle, certain posts align with the rising sun at the spring and autumn, equinoxes, and at the summer and winter solstices. By watching which post the sun rises over on a given morning, the people of Cahokia could track the seasons with precision, knowing exactly when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold ceremonies, when to prepare for winter. The principle is identical to Stonehenge. The material is different, wood instead of stone, and wood does not survive the centuries the way stone does, which is why Woodhenge had to be discovered through archaeological excavation, rather than standing as a visible monument. But the astronomical knowledge it embodies is every bit as sophisticated as anything at Stonehenge or any Egyptian solar temple. The people of Cahokia are playing a game. You can see them on the plaza, groups of men running and throwing, and the game is called Chunky, and it is the most popular sport in the Mississippian world. Chunky is played with a polished stone disc, about the size of a hockey puck, made from carefully selected and ground stone that can take weeks to prepare. One player rolls the disc across the smooth surface of the plaza, and as it rolls, the other players throw long wooden spears at the spot where they think the disc will stop. The player whose spear lands closest to the resting disc wins. It sounds simple, but Chunky is not just a game. It is a social institution, a way of settling disputes, building alliances, redistributing wealth, and establishing status within the community. People bet on Chunky games, sometimes heavily, wagering their possessions, their clothing, even their homes. The game is played with such intensity and such passion that early European observers who encountered it centuries later were astonished by the emotional investment of the players and the spectators. Chunky stones are among the most carefully crafted artifacts in Mississippian culture, ground and polished to a perfect smoothness, and they have been found at sites across the eastern United States, evidence that the game and the social practices associated with it spread from Cahokia throughout the Mississippian world. The residential neighbourhoods of Cahokia are organised into clusters of houses, each cluster surrounding a small courtyard, a pattern that suggests extended family groups living in close proximity. The houses are built of wood and thatch, with walls of woven cane plastered with clay, and they are small, perhaps 12 to 15 feet on a side. Single-room structures where families sleep and store their belongings, but where most of daily life happens outside in the courtyards and on the plaza and in the fields. The people of Cahokia are farmers. They grow maize, the sacred corn that arrived from Mexico centuries earlier, and that has been adapted through generations of selective breeding to the climate and the soils of the Mississippi Valley. The story of maize in North America is itself one of the great botanical achievements in human history. Maize originated in Mexico as a wild grass called teosinte, a scraggly plant with tiny seed heads that look nothing like the fat golden ears of corn we know today. Over thousands of years, Mesoamerican farmers transformed teosinte into maize through selective breeding, and the resulting crop spread north through trade and migration, arriving in the American Southwest around 2100 BC and gradually moving east and north over the following centuries. But tropical Mexican corn does not grow well in the shorter days and cooler temperatures of the temperate Midwest. The people who brought maize north had to adapt it, generation by generation, selecting for varieties that could mature in a shorter growing season, that could tolerate cooler nights, that could produce large ears with the limited sunshine of higher latitudes. This is plant breeding on a timeline of centuries, a slow patient transformation that required observing and selecting and saving seed, and planting and observing again, year after year, decade after decade, until the tropical grass of Mexico became northern flint corn, a hardy variety perfectly adapted to the climate of the Mississippi Valley and the Great Lakes region. And they did not grow corn alone. They developed the Three Sisters, one of the most ingenious agricultural systems ever devised. Corn, beans and squash planted together in the same mound, each plant supporting the others. The corn grows tall, providing a pole for the beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen from the air into the soil, fertilizing the corn and the squash. The squash spreads its broad leaves across the ground, shading out weeds and retaining moisture. Together, the three plants produce a complete protein diet, the corn providing carbohydrates, the beans providing protein and amino acids that corn lacks, and the squash providing vitamins and additional calories. The Three Sisters system is so efficient and so nutritionally complete that it sustained millions of people across eastern North America for centuries, and it is still grown today by Native American communities who maintain the seeds and the knowledge of their ancestors. This is not primitive farming, this is ecological engineering, a system designed to work with the biology of the plants and the chemistry of the soil to produce maximum nutrition with minimum labour. They grow squash and beans and sunflower and tobacco. They supplement their crops with hunting and fishing, taking deer and turkey from the forests and fish from the river and the oxbow lakes of the floodplain. The food supply is abundant, so abundant that it supports not just the city's population, but a class of specialists who do not farm, people who build mounds and carve shell and make pottery and conduct ceremonies and manage the complex social and political life of the largest city on the continent. The sounds of Cahokia at midday are the sounds of a city. You can hear the thock of stone tools shaping wood. You can hear the scrape of stone on shell as artisans carve the marine shell gorgets and pendants that are the most prized luxury goods in the Mississippian world. You can hear dogs barking, children laughing, women calling to each other across the courtyards, the deep rhythmic thud of pestles in mortars as women grind the dried maize that is the staple food of the city. You can hear music. The Cahokians made flutes from bird bone and rattles from gourd and turtle shell, and the sound of these instruments would have been a constant background presence in a city of this size. Music for ceremonies, music for entertainment, music for the simple pleasure of making sound on a warm afternoon in the greatest city on the continent. You can smell cooking. Maize being roasted on coals, fish being smoked over slow fires of hickory and oak, venison stew bubbling in clay pots, the smell of tobacco smoke drifting from the ceremonial precinct where priests are conducting rituals in the shadow of Monk's Mound. And underneath all these human smells, the smell of the river, the Mississippi, broad and brown and ancient, carrying its load of silt from half a continent, the river that made this city possible, the river that provided the fertile floodplain soil, the fish, the transportation network, the water, everything that a city needs. Cahokia is a river city, as much a product of the Mississippi as Memphis and Thebes were products of the Nile, and the parallels between the two river civilizations, one in Africa and one in North America, are too striking to ignore. Both depended on the annual flood cycle of their great river to fertilize the agricultural land that fed their populations. Both built their greatest monuments on the floodplain, as close to the river as they could get without being flooded. Both organized their cities around a central axis that connected the principal monument, the pyramid or the mound, to the river and to the cardinal directions. Both used the river as a highway, moving goods and people and ideas up and down its length in boats. Both expressed their political and religious authority through monumental construction, building higher and bigger to demonstrate the power of their leaders and the glory of their gods. The Mississippi is not the Nile. It does not flow through a desert. It flows through a landscape of staggering fertility, bottomland forests and oxbow lakes and swamps and prairies, and the richest agricultural soil on the planet. And the civilization it produced was different from Egypt in 1,000 ways. But the fundamental relationship between the river and the civilization is the same, and seeing Cahokia as the Mississippi's answer to Memphis or Thebes is not a stretch. It is a recognition of a truth that has been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The parallels between Cahokia and ancient Egypt are not exact, but they are instructive. Both are river civilizations, dependent on the fertility of a great river's floodplain, the Nile for Egypt, the Mississippi for Cahokia. Both build pyramids, of stone in Egypt and of earth in Cahokia, as the centerpieces of their urban landscapes. Both develop complex social hierarchies with an elite class that commands the labor and the resources of a large population. Both orient their monuments to the movements of the sun and the stars. Both eventually decline and are abandoned, Egypt gradually over centuries of foreign invasion and internal decay, Cahokia more suddenly and more mysteriously, its population dispersing into the surrounding countryside for reasons that archaeologists are still debating. And both are eventually forgotten by the wider world, their monuments left to the elements, their stories lost until archaeologists come along centuries later and begin the slow work of reading the evidence in the ground. But Cahokia was not alone. Cahokia was the largest and most powerful center in a vast Mississippian world that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast and from the Great Plains to the Atlantic seaboard. Hundreds of Mississippian communities, each with their own mounds and plazas and political hierarchies, were linked to Cahokia through trade and cultural exchange and perhaps political allegiance, forming a network of related societies that shared a common set of religious symbols, artistic traditions, and architectural forms. Moundville, in central Alabama, was the second largest Mississippian center, a planned city of over 3,000 people built on a bluff above the Black Warrior River, with 29 mounds arranged around a rectangular plaza in a pattern that reflects the social hierarchy of the community. The largest and most important mounds nearest the plaza center, the smaller and less important ones at the periphery. Moundville's artisans produced some of the finest objects in the Mississippian world: carved shell gorgets depicting warriors and mythological beings, ceramic vessels shaped like human heads with closed eyes that are among the most recognizable artifacts in North American archaeology, and engraved stone palettes that depict a complex iconography of winged serpents, sun circles, forked eyes, and other symbols that archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a shared symbolic language that linked Mississippian communities across the Southeast the way Christian iconography linked medieval European communities. Etowah, in northwestern Georgia, was another major Mississippian center, built on the banks of the Etowah River with 6 mounds and a massive defensive ditch that enclosed the central precinct. The most famous artifacts from Etowah are a pair of marble statues, a male and a female figure, carved with a skill and a naturalism that astonished the archaeologists who found them in a burial mound in the 1950s. The figures are seated, their hands resting on their knees, their faces serene and lifelike, and they represent the finest examples of stone sculpture in the Mississippian tradition. They are small enough to hold in your hands, but the artistry is monumental. Spiro, in eastern Oklahoma, was the westernmost major Mississippian center, and its burial mounds contained one of the richest collections of artifacts ever found in North America. When the mounds at Spiro were looted in the 1930s by commercial treasure hunters who dynamited the burial chambers and sold the contents, the loss to archaeology was incalculable. What survived includes engraved marine shells depicting elaborate ceremonial scenes, copper plates embossed with images of warriors and priests, carved stone pipes of extraordinary skill, and woven textiles preserved by contact with copper. The Spiro artifacts scattered across private collections and museums provide a glimpse of a Mississippian artistic tradition that was as rich and as varied as anything in the contemporary Old World. The Mississippian world was not a single civilization, in the way that Egypt was a single civilization. It was more like medieval Europe, a collection of related societies sharing a common cultural heritage, but politically independent, sometimes allied and sometimes at war, each with its own leaders and its own traditions and its own relationship to the shared Mississippian identity. And like medieval Europe, it produced art and architecture and social complexity that would have been immediately recognizable to any visitor from the Old World as the products of a sophisticated civilization. Egypt was rediscovered by Napoleon's expedition in 1798. Cahokia was not seriously studied until the 20th century. And while Egypt has become one of the most famous and most studied civilizations in human history, Cahokia remains largely unknown outside of archaeological circles, a city that was bigger than London hidden in plain sight in the American Midwest, its mounds visible from the highway, its story untold in most history books, its people unnamed and unremembered by the civilization that built over and around their legacy. This is the injustice that tonight's story is trying to address. Not by diminishing Egypt, which is genuinely one of the great achievements of the human species, but by insisting that North America belongs in the same conversation, not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, not as a primitive precursor to real civilization, but as a parallel story of human genius, running alongside the Egyptian story and the Mesopotamian story and the Chinese story and the Indian story, equal in creativity, equal in ambition, equal in the depth of its engagement with the fundamental questions of human existence. Because here is what the parallel timeline reveals when you step back and look at it as a whole. At every point in the history of the Old World where something remarkable is happening, something equally remarkable is happening in North America. When Egypt builds the pyramids, North America builds Poverty Point. When Greece develops philosophy, the Hopewell developed geometry encoded in earthworks. When Rome builds its empire, the Puebloan ancestors begin building in stone. When medieval Europe builds its cathedrals, Cahokia builds Monk's Mound. The specifics are different, the materials are different, the scale varies. But the underlying impulse is the same human need to build, to organize, to understand the world, to create something that outlasts the individual, to leave a mark on the landscape that says we were here, we mattered, we understood something about the universe and we encoded it in earth and stone for our descendants to find. The people of North America did all of this. They did it without writing, which means we cannot read their thoughts in their own words. They did it without metal tools, which means they accomplished with bone and stone and wood what the Egyptians accomplished with copper and bronze. They did it without the wheel, which means every pound of earth in every mound was carried by hand. And they did it without any contact with the Old World, which means every innovation, every technique, every artistic style, every astronomical observation, every geometric calculation was developed independently, from scratch, by people working out the problems of civilization on their own, with no one to copy and no model to follow except the landscape and the sky, and the needs of their own communities. That is not primitive. That is extraordinary. That is one of the great untold stories of the human species, and tonight, lying in the dark with your eyes closed and your breathing slowing, and the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders, you have heard it. You have walked through the parallel timeline. You have stood at Watson Break 5,500 years ago and watched people build mounds 1,000 years before the pyramids. You have stood at Poverty Point and seen the bird mound rising from the Louisiana bluff. You have walked the concentric ridges of Newark and felt the moonlight tracking across the octagon on its 19-year cycle. You have climbed Monk's Mound at Cahokia and looked out over a city of 20,000 people and a grand plaza larger than anything in medieval Europe. And you have seen, I hope, that the history of North America is not a blank page waiting for European ink. It is a book, an enormous book, written in earth and stone and alignment and trade goods and pottery and carved bone and shaped copper and woven baskets, and the oral traditions of peoples who carried their knowledge in their memories and passed it to their children and their grandchildren across hundreds of generations. The book is not easy to read. It requires patience and humility and a willingness to accept that civilization can look different from what we expected, that it does not have to involve pyramids of cut stone or hieroglyphic inscriptions, or bronze chariots to be real and valid and worthy of awe. But the book is there. It has always been there. And tonight you have read a few of its pages. And here is one more thing that makes the North American story different from the Egyptian story, and in some ways more remarkable. The descendants of the people who built these mounds and earthworks and great houses are still here. The Egyptian civilization that built the pyramids is gone. The language is dead. The religion is dead. The social structures that made the pyramids possible have not existed for 2,000 years. Egypt's monuments are the relics of a civilization that ended, but the descendants of the people who built Watson Brake and Poverty Point still live in Louisiana. The descendants of the Hopewell still live in Ohio. The descendants of the people who built Cahokia are the modern Osage and the Quapaw and the Degahan Siouan peoples, who carry the memory of the great city in their oral traditions. The descendants of the people who built Chaco Canyon are the Hopi and the Zuni and the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, who still conduct ceremonies at their ancestral sites and who consider Chaco a living sacred place, not a ruin. The North American civilizations that we have been talking about tonight are not dead civilizations. They are the ancestors of living peoples, peoples who endured colonization and forced removal and attempted cultural destruction, and who are still here, still telling their stories, still maintaining their connections to the land and the mounds and the earthworks and the great houses that their ancestors built. This is not ancient history in the way that Egypt is ancient history. This is family history. This is the story of people whose grandchildren and great-grandchildren are alive right now, sleeping somewhere tonight under the same stars that their ancestors used to align their mounds and calculate their calendars and navigate their canoes across rivers and lakes and oceans of grass. The mounds are not relics. They are heirlooms. They belong to someone. They are loved by someone. They are remembered by someone. And that makes them different from the pyramids, which belong to everyone and to no one, which stand in the desert as monuments to a civilization that has no living descendants, no unbroken chain of memory connecting the builders to the present. The mounds of North America have that chain. It is frayed in places. It has been cut and retied and stretched almost to breaking by 5 centuries of colonization. But it is not broken. The people are still here. The memory is still alive. And the mounds are still standing, patient and green and quiet, waiting for the rest of the world to notice what has been here all along. And tonight, you have noticed. You have seen the parallel timeline. You have held both stories in your mind at the same time, the Egyptian and the American, the stone and the earth, the Nile and the Mississippi, and you have seen that they are both extraordinary, both worthy of wonder, both products of the same restless, building, dreaming, sky-watching, death-defying species that you belong to. This stubborn, brilliant species that looks at a hilltop and sees a serpent, that looks at a river valley and sees a city, that looks at the stars and builds monuments to catch their light. Let the story settle now. Let the images blur and merge. The white limestone of Giza and the packed earth of Poverty Point, the Nile and the Mississippi, the pharaoh's tomb and the bird mound, the concentric ridges and the concentric rings of Woodhenge, the copper from Lake Superior and the gold from Nubia, 2 streams of human genius flowing through time on opposite sides of the world, never meeting, never knowing about each other, both equally human, both equally real. The night is getting deeper now. The images are fading. Let me walk you through one final journey before sleep takes you, a nighttime tour across the ancient continent, visiting each of these places as they are right now, tonight, in the darkness. Watson Brake, in the bend of the bayou in northeastern Louisiana, is quiet. The 11 mounds are still there, low green hills rising from the floodplain, barely visible in the darkness, covered with trees and undergrowth, the bayou running slow and black beside them. Frogs are singing in the swamp. An owl calls from the cypress trees. The mounds have been standing here for 5,500 years, longer than any other monument in North America, longer than Stonehenge, longer than the pyramids. They have outlasted every empire, every kingdom, every civilization that has risen and fallen on the other side of the Atlantic since the day the last basket of earth was placed on the last ridge. They are the oldest. They are patient. They will be here long after everything else is gone. Poverty Point, on its bluff above the floodplain, is quiet too. The concentric ridges are still visible, grassy arcs curving through the Louisiana darkness, and the bird mound rises from the bluff top like a sleeping giant, its wings spread, its head pointed toward the river that no longer runs where it ran 3,000 years ago. The site is a World Heritage Site now, recognised by UNESCO as one of the most significant archaeological sites in the Americas. But on a dark night in February, with the winter stars turning overhead and the wind moving through the bare branches of the oaks, it feels like what it has always been, a place where something important happened. A place where people gathered and built and traded and cooked and told stories and watched the sky, and then eventually moved on, leaving their mounds behind like a message in a language that we are still learning to read. In Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound lies along its hilltop ridge in the darkness, a quarter-mile of earth shaped like a snake, invisible from the ground, visible only from above, from the vantage point of the stars that the builders may have been speaking to. The serpent is eating the sun, or the egg, or whatever the oval at its mouth represents, and it has been eating it for over 1,000 years, frozen in the act of swallowing, and the stars wheel above it the way they have wheeled above it every night since it was built, and the serpent does not move, and the stars do not stop, and the conversation between the earth and the sky continues in a language older than words. The Newark earthworks, the perfect circle and the perfect octagon, are partially preserved in a municipal park and a golf course. Of all things, one of the most mathematically precise constructions of the ancient world turned into a place where people hit small white balls with metal sticks. But the geometry is still there, still precise, still aligned with the moon's 18.6-year cycle, still encoding knowledge that took generations to acquire and that the builders wanted to preserve forever, not in a book but in the shape of the earth itself. Cahokia, across the river from St. Louis, is dark. Monk's Mound is still there, 100 feet tall, looming over the surrounding flatland, visible from the interstate highway that passes a few hundred yards away. Most of the drivers on that highway have no idea what they are looking at. They see a big hill. They do not see the city of 20,000 that once surrounded it, or the grand plaza that once stretched before it, or the wooden palisade that once encircled it, or the wood henge that once marked the solstices beside it. They see a big hill in a field, and they drive past at 70 miles an hour, and the greatest city in ancient North America watches them go and says nothing. Chaco Canyon is dark and cold, the high desert temperature dropping toward freezing, the stars blazing overhead with an intensity that you never see in the city, because there is no light pollution for 100 miles in any direction, and the Milky Way arches across the sky like a river of light, and the great houses stand in the canyon below, their stone walls silver in the starlight, their empty rooms open to the sky, the silence so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat. The pyramids are sinking into the sand, and the mounds are sinking into the grass, and the rivers are running silent and dark, and the stars are coming out. The same stars, the same sky, the same Milky Way that the Egyptians called the Nile of the heavens, and that the Pawnee read like a map. The same darkness that has covered both continents every night for 10,000 years, and will cover them tonight, right now, as you lie here breathing slowly and letting the centuries pass like clouds. The people who built Watson Break are asleep. The people who built the Great Pyramid are asleep. The people who built Poverty Point and Cahokia and Newark and Monk's Mound are asleep. The pharaohs are asleep in their granite sarcophagi, and the mound builders are asleep in their earthen tombs, and the whole ancient world is asleep, dreaming its long, slow dream of earth and sky and water. And you can sleep too. You can close your eyes and let the darkness take the shapes and the names and the dates and the numbers and dissolve them into the soft, warm nothing of approaching sleep. And if any image stays with you, let it be this one. 2 pyramids, one of stone, one of earth, one in the desert, one in the forest, both built by human hands, both reaching toward the sky, both saying the same thing, in different materials and different languages, on opposite sides of the same small planet. We are here. We were here. Remember us. If you have enjoyed this journey across the ancient world, you can gently tap like. You can leave a comment and tell me where you are tonight, what time it is, whether you are closer to the Nile or the Mississippi. If you want to walk with us regularly into these stories about the world that was here before ours, you can subscribe. And if you feel moved to support the channel in a deeper way, there is the option to join as a member. But truly, being here, listening, resting, drifting towards sleep as 2 ancient rivers flow through the darkness on opposite sides of the world, that is already enough. The Nile is flowing tonight, the same direction it has flowed for millions of years, north through the desert toward the Mediterranean, past the pyramids that have stood on its western bank for 4,500 years, The oldest monuments in the world that are still standing, still catching the light, still astonishing everyone who sees them. And the Mississippi is flowing tonight too, south through the heartland of the continent, past the mounds that have stood on its banks for 5,000 years, older than the pyramids, less famous than the pyramids, but just as real, just as human, just as extraordinary. 2 rivers, 2 civilizations, 2 ways of being human, both of them yours, both of them part of the story of your species, the story of what we do when we find ourselves alive on a small planet with big skies and not enough time and the unshakable conviction that we should build something, anything, that will last longer than we do. Something that says to the future I was here and I understood something, and I wanted you to know. Rest now. The mounds are quiet, the pyramids are dark, the rivers are still, the stars are turning overhead, the same stars, the same slow wheel, and somewhere beneath them, in the earth of Louisiana and Ohio and Illinois and New Mexico, the foundations of a civilization that nobody told you about are sleeping the way they have slept for thousands of years, patient and quiet and waiting to be remembered. And so can you.